The invisible passenger. The scent of fresh leather and a hint of citrus from the carefully curated in-flight welcome wipes mingled in the air of the first-class cabin. Everything gleamed, from the brushed aluminum trim to the deep mahogany-colored accents of the reclining seats. This wasn't merely a section of a plane. It was a sanctuary of privilege, quiet luxury, and unspoken hierarchy. And somewhere in the middle of all this glimmer and polish sat a man whose name had quietly shaped the digital universe, Sundar Pichai. Clad in a simple navy blue zip-up jacket over a light gray t-shirt, with no watch flashing from his wrist and not a single logo announcing his worth, Sundar blended in so seamlessly that he could have easily been mistaken for a startup intern flying on points rather than the CEO of Google. He walked onto the aircraft carrying only a slim backpack, paused briefly to nod at the flight attendants, and quietly took his seat by the window in 2A. The flight was scheduled from New York to San Francisco, and even in a cabin populated by executives, celebrities, and elite frequent flyers, Sundar's presence went largely unnoticed. That is, until one particular moment shattered the cocoon of civility and revealed an unexpected crack in the social facade. Flight attendant Karina had worked for the airline for over 15 years. Sharp, efficient, and always on point, she prided herself on her intuition and people skills, skills honed by serving countless high-profile passengers and dealing with everything from unruly rock stars to stoic diplomats. She had an instinct for the wealthy and important, and she wore it like a sixth sense. But even instincts falter when bias slips quietly in. As the cabin doors sealed and pre-takeoff checks began, Karina moved through first class with the practiced ease of someone who knew exactly how to read a person, until her gaze landed on Sundar. Something about him, his modest clothes, his lack of obvious designer accessories, and the soft-spoken thank you when she offered him a menu, made her hesitate. Not out of suspicion, but out of assumption. He didn't look like the others. He didn't sound like the high-powered types who usually occupied the front rows. And so, in a single subtle moment, she placed him in an invisible category. A fluke, a mistake in the manifest. Maybe a last-minute upgrade. Maybe someone with too many miles and not enough money. "Sir," she said with a tone more clipped than courteous, "this section is reserved for first-class passengers. You may have taken the wrong seat." Sundar looked up from his seat calmly, almost too calmly. There was no flash of indignation in his eyes, only a mild confusion. "This is seat 2A, correct?" he asked, his voice as serene as a lake untouched by wind. "Yes," Karina replied, her brows tightening. "But..." She glanced down at her tablet, searching for an explanation, trying to find a way to ask, "Are you sure you belong here?" without saying the words out loud. Before she could continue, another flight attendant approached with a discreet whisper. "He's on the manifest." Sundar Pichai. Karina's face shifted almost imperceptibly. The name landed like a quiet thunderclap. She knew it, of course. Everyone in tech, in business, even in culture knew it. But the man sitting in 2A didn't match the mental image she'd created. He wasn't wearing the trappings of power. He was power, dressed in humility. "I'm terribly sorry, Mr. Pichai," she said quickly, her tone now formal, her smile forced, and too bright. "Just a routine check. Would you like a glass of Krug while we wait for takeoff?" Sundar gave a polite nod, brushing past the awkwardness. "Water is fine. Thank you." But the damage had been done. The cabin resumed its quiet buzz. Other passengers, noticing the exchange, had varied reactions. A middle-aged executive with a Rolex glanced sideways, registering Sundar with renewed curiosity. A younger tech enthusiast across the aisle blinked in disbelief, nudging his travel companion as if to say, "That's him. That's the guy." But Sundar himself didn't flinch. He'd experienced moments like this before. At conferences, at board meetings, in lobbies where he was asked to wait while younger, louder men were ushered in. Even as the head of one of the world's most influential companies, He had never fully escaped the quiet assumptions that came with his background. His skin, his accent, his unwillingness to perform power the way others did. Karina returned moments later with his water, her professionalism now coated in overly cautious politeness. "Again, I hope you'll forgive the mix-up. Sometimes passengers get upgraded at the last minute and—" "It's all right," he interrupted gently. "I understand." But as the plane taxied down the runway and lifted into the pale blue afternoon sky, Sundar looked out the window, his mind a whirlwind, not of anger, but of reflection. He thought of the long road from Chennai to Silicon Valley. He thought of the years spent studying by candlelight during power outages, the narrow kitchen in his family's small home, the metal lunchbox his mother packed with steaming idlis every morning. He thought of the first time he touched a computer at IIT Kharagpur, how the screen glowed like a doorway into another life. And he thought about how, even now, after all this time and all this progress, the world still sometimes failed to see beyond the surface. But he was not bitter. If anything, he felt a quiet responsibility. He had once told a group of graduating students at his alma mater, "Be patient. People will underestimate you. Let them. It's an advantage." In that moment, in the quiet hum of the airplane, he understood that life would always offer reminders, some kind, others uncomfortable, of where he came from and how far he'd come. And perhaps this uncomfortable encounter was not meant to humiliate, but to highlight an opportunity to confront subtle prejudice with dignity, to respond not with pride or ego, but with grace. Back in the galley, Karina stood quietly, going over the passenger manifest again. A flicker of shame gnawed at her. She knew what she'd done, even if she hadn't meant to. She didn't know the full story, but she'd seen the shift. She realized, in a way she hadn't before, how easy it was to judge, to categorize, to look at someone and make a decision about their worth without ever really seeing them. And that's where this story truly begins, not with humiliation, but with recognition. A moment not of disgrace, but of opportunity. A single flight, a mistaken assumption, and the quiet strength of a man who carried the future of billions in his pocket, but chose to travel light. The echoes of assumption. The plane soared somewhere above Pennsylvania, slicing through pale clouds like a brush painting across canvas. Sundar Pichai sat quietly in his seat, his water untouched on the tray, his gaze fixed not on the in-flight screen or the polished mahogany table, but somewhere far beyond the window's glass, a space known only to those who live between past and present. The incident with the flight attendant, though not loud or overtly offensive, had clung to him like the lingering echo of an old bruise. It wasn't the first time the world had tried to fit him into a smaller box than he had earned, but this time, something about it felt heavier, more telling. Maybe it was the sheer subtlety of the moment, the way the judgment was wrapped in civility, hidden in plain sight. In the lavish silence of first class, where glasses clinked quietly and pillows were fluffed to perfection, Sundar's mind wandered through time like a determined traveler on an old, winding road. He thought back to his early days in the United States, when he was a graduate student at Stanford, arriving with a scholarship, a borrowed coat, and a heart full of dreams that had yet to meet their moment. He remembered the small things, the payphone in the dorm lobby he used to call home, counting coins before dialing, the thick Indian accent that drew polite but condescending smiles from clerks and fellow students alike. Back then, he had no titles, no status. Just intelligence, relentless patience, and an understanding that the world often noticed noise before brilliance. He had learned, slowly but surely, how to navigate a culture that revered confidence, but often overlooked quiet competence. He didn't raise his voice to be heard. Instead, he let his work whisper volumes. Bit by bit, room by room, line by line of code, he rose, not through arrogance, but through clarity. He had become a builder, a thinker, a leader. Yet moments like today's, so brief, so seemingly insignificant, still prove that even at the highest altitudes, gravity found ways to pull you back to earth. Karina, meanwhile, had retreated to the galley, her smile still fixed for the remaining passengers, but her thoughts far from routine service. She had dealt with thousands of travelers, some demanding, others indifferent, a few kind. But this had unsettled her. She had made a mistake, a quiet one, but no less potent for its subtlety. She hadn't been rude. She hadn't said anything explicitly offensive, but she had assumed based on appearance, assumed based on silence, assumed based on everything except truth. What troubled her more wasn't just that she had misjudged Sundar Pichai, but that she had almost dismissed him entirely. If it hadn't been for her colleague who recognized his name, what would have followed? Would she have asked him to move? Would the others have stared, chuckled behind their designer sunglasses, felt justified in the hierarchy they silently enforced? And why did this one error cling to her conscience when so many others slipped through unexamined? Because this time, she realized, the man she had judged didn't respond with indignation or ego. He hadn't corrected her in anger, hadn't demanded respect or recognition. He simply asked a question, gently, with dignity, as though allowing her the chance to catch herself. It wasn't his response that shamed her, it was his restraint. An hour passed. The cabin dimmed. Some passengers reclined for sleep, some worked on their laptops, others sipped their wine and enjoyed the illusion of being above the world, both literally and figuratively. But Sundar remained still, lost in reflection. He thought about the thousands of engineers he led, many from backgrounds like his, quiet geniuses whose names were known only in the corners of tech forums and innovation labs. He thought about the young dreamers across the world who looked up to him, not because he was a CEO, but because he had made it from where they stood. He knew that visibility mattered, representation mattered, but what mattered more was the integrity with which one handled moments of invisibility. He reached for his phone, not to email or scroll, but to open a note he kept buried in a private folder. It was a quote, one he had saved years ago. Our dignity is not in what others see in us, but in what we continue to be when they don't. It had gotten him through job interviews where he wasn't chosen, through meetings where louder voices drowned him out, through countless rooms where he was the only one with his skin, his story, his accent. The hum of the plane was constant, soothing. Karina reappeared, quietly this time, not with drinks or meals, but with something closer to an apology. A tray of warm spiced nuts, and a card she had written quickly during her break. She knelt slightly, discreetly, beside his seat, and set it down with care. "Mr. Pichai," she said softly, making sure not to draw the attention of the surrounding passengers. "I wanted to apologize. Truly. I realize I made an assumption about you, and I've been thinking about it since takeoff. You didn't deserve that. No one does. I'm sorry." Sundar looked at her, not with judgment, but with something deeper. Understanding. Perhaps even a trace of compassion. "Thank you," he said. "It's easy to make mistakes. What matters is that you noticed." She nodded slowly, grateful for the grace she hadn't expected. And in that moment, something unspoken passed between them, a kind of healing. Not dramatic, not the kind that leads to applause, but the quiet kind that actually changes people. As Karina walked away, she felt lighter, not just because she had apologized, but because she had seen. For the first time in a long time, she realized how easily surface can blind us to substance, how power doesn't always come dressed in prestige, how sometimes the most important people are the ones who don't feel the need to prove it. Sundar leaned back in his seat, closing his eyes not to sleep, but to breathe. Somewhere, thousands of feet above the ordinary world, he had been reminded that humility was not weakness, it was strength disguised as quiet. And sometimes, it was in moments like these, uncomfortable and unscripted, that one's purpose revealed itself again. Not as a CEO, not as a public figure, but as a mirror for those still learning to see. A conversation at 35,000 feet. Night had swallowed the sky by the time the aircraft reached its cruising altitude over the Rockies. Through the oval window, stars shimmered faintly against a velvet black backdrop, while below, the world slept under a blanket of clouds, unaware of the quiet revelations unfolding in the cabin above. The ambient light of the first-class cabin dimmed to a gentle hue, reflecting the hush of late evening. Sundar Pichai sat in stillness, his thoughts no longer lingering solely on the awkward exchange with the flight attendant, but expanding outward, toward something more profound, more universal. It wasn't just about how he was perceived. It was about how easily the world accepted its perceptions as truth. As if summoned by the pull of that thought, the man in 2B, who had remained largely quiet until now, leaned slightly toward Sundar. He was tall, in his early 50s perhaps, with streaks of silver in his beard and the air of someone who had spent much of his life closing deals across time zones. He'd been typing steadily on his laptop, headphones on, but the subtle energy of the earlier exchange had clearly not escaped him. He removed his headphones and placed his laptop aside, his voice low, almost conspiratorial. "Mind if I ask you something, Mr. Pichai?" The man said, not with deference, but with curiosity, the respectful kind that seeks to understand rather than praise. Sundar turned to him, offering the slightest of smiles, already familiar with this tone, the one that followed recognition. "Of course," he replied, calmly. The man hesitated for a moment, as if measuring his words. "You handled that moment earlier with remarkable calm. Most CEOs I've met, especially in the circles I run in, would have made it a spectacle. I'm curious, why didn't you?" Sundar considered the question, not rushing to answer, allowing the weight of it to sit between them. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured, thoughtful. "Because every time I've been underestimated in my life, I've learned something about others, yes, but more importantly, about myself. Power doesn't need to prove itself. Real leadership isn't loud. It's what you choose not to do that defines you." The man leaned back, nodding slowly. "That's rare. I've spent the last 25 years advising companies, merging brands, making people richer. And yet, what you just said, that hits different. Do you ever get tired of having to prove yourself despite everything you've accomplished?" Sundar looked out the window for a moment, as if trying to locate the right memory in the dark. "I don't think I ever expected to be fully seen. Not in the way people mean it. I've learned to live in the in-between space, the space where what you do matters more than how you look doing it. Yes, there are moments like today that remind me how easy it is for people to forget, or never know, who you really are. But if you let that define your response, you let the misunderstanding win. You become reactionary instead of intentional." The man studied Sundar with a thoughtful intensity. "You're a lot quieter than I imagined. All these interviews and panels I've seen online, you're always so composed. But in person, you're even more still." Sundar chuckled softly. "Stillness is how I survive. The world expects its leaders to be performers, always on, always speaking, always commanding. But the most powerful moments in my life have been quiet. The first time I wrote a piece of code that worked after days of debugging. The moment I saw my parents' face light up when I got my scholarship to Stanford. Even walking into the office after being named CEO. I didn't shout, didn't call anyone. I just sat at my desk and got to work." A pause hung between them, long but comfortable. The man, who introduced himself as Michael, confessed something then. Something raw. "I envy that. The stillness. I built my life on noise. Flashy titles, fast deals, luxury, control. And yet, the more I got, the more I realized I had to keep proving I deserved it. The suit, the car, the corner office, they became my armor. I think if someone questioned whether I belonged in first class like they did to you, I'd be angry, defensive, probably file a complaint." Sundar nodded gently. "That's a choice too. But what we do with those moments, when our worth is questioned, when we're seen as smaller than we are, that's what shapes our legacy. Not just the empires we build, but the grace with which we walk through storms. I've never believed in power that demands acknowledgement. I believe in presence. Quiet, persistent, authentic presence. Michael leaned back, visibly moved, his eyes distant now, as if reflecting on something long buried under years of ambition. You've given me more to think about than any boardroom ever has. Meanwhile, in the galley, Karina lingered near the curtain that separated first class from the rest of the cabin. Her shift was still on, her tasks still in motion, but her mind kept replaying the exchange she had observed just now. Sundar wasn't just composed, he was kind. Not performative, not defensive, not silent in arrogance, but centered in something she couldn't name. It humbled her all over again. She picked up the empty glassware from the bar cart with care, her steps a bit more thoughtful, her service a bit more human. The job had become mechanical over the years, but tonight something shifted. Maybe it wasn't just about fine wine and perfect presentation. Maybe it was also about noticing. The kind of noticing that transcended class and status, that saw humanity before hierarchy. Back in seat 2A, Sundar finally reached for his backpack and pulled out a worn leather notebook. It wasn't digital. It wasn't sleek. It was old, filled with scribbles, ideas, thoughts, quotes. A habit he had carried since his school days in India. He flipped to a fresh page and began writing. Not code, not a speech, but a reflection. True power isn't measured in recognition. It's measured in how you treat the world when no one knows your name. Or worse, when they think they do, and they're wrong. Grace isn't a performance. It's the deepest form of strength. The turbulence of earlier had settled, not in the skies, but in the soul. The unexpected passenger. The night deepened, and the cabin of the Boeing 787 Dreamliner existed in a surreal in-between world. Neither day nor night, neither earth nor space. Wrapped in its ambient glow and low hum, the first-class cabin took on the tone of a sanctuary. It was a space suspended from time, where travelers drifted somewhere between destinations and identities. Sundar Pichai, still seated in 2A, had closed his notebook, but not his mind. The conversation with Michael had opened something deeper, a line of thought that meandered through memory, observation, and quiet contemplation. As the plane began its slow descent into the second half of the journey, a slight movement in the aisle caught Sundar's attention. A young woman, probably in her early 30s, was speaking softly to one of the flight attendants. There was a moment of hesitation, some murmured clarification, and then, surprisingly, the flight attendant pointed toward Sundar. The woman's eyes followed, and when they landed on him, they widened slightly, not in awe, but in a strange mix of disbelief and recognition. She approached slowly, her posture respectful but not timid. Her hair was tied back in a functional bun, and she wore no makeup, only a lanyard with a tech company's logo still visible around her neck, as if she boarded the flight in a rush after a long day at a developers conference. "Excuse me," she said gently. I'm sorry to bother you, but are you Sundar Pichai?" Sundar looked up, his expression softening. "Yes, I am." Her face lit up, not with excitement, but with the subtle relief of someone who had just confirmed something deeply personal. She gave a small, nervous laugh. "I can't believe this. I don't even know if you remember, but my name is Leena Veradarajan. I was at IIT Madras. You came to speak there in 2008. You stayed after the talk, and I asked you about navigating the bias I'd already started feeling in tech. I was just 19 then. You said something that changed my life." Sundar leaned forward slightly, nodding with interest. His face revealed no strain to recall, only genuine attention. "I remember that visit," he said thoughtfully. "We had a long Q&A that day. What did I say that stuck with you?" Leena smiled, and in her eyes was the flicker of an old memory brought back to life. "You told me, don't fight for a seat at their table. Build your own table. Invite others like you. Make it bigger than theirs." I never forgot that. I wrote it down and carried it with me through every rejection email, every cold interview, every moment someone looked past me in a meeting. Sundar was quiet, moved. He remembered saying those words, but it was different hearing them echoed back more than a decade later, especially from someone who had clearly lived them. I work at a startup now, Lena continued, leading our AI ethics division. We're trying to build tech that sees people, not just data. It's not easy, but I don't think I'd be here at all if I hadn't heard you speak that day. The weight of her words settled deeply into the moment, creating a ripple between them that somehow felt louder than the jet engines outside. Sundar gestured for her to take the empty seat in 2C across the aisle. She hesitated only a second before sitting down, and in that brief moment, time folded in on itself, connecting past and present in a way only stories can. They spoke for what felt like hours, about biases in AI, about the responsibility of creating technology that didn't replicate human prejudice, about the fine line between ambition and integrity in an industry obsessed with speed and disruption. Lena was bright, fierce, empathetic. Her words had the edge of someone who had endured, who had earned her wisdom through fire rather than inheritance. You know, she said after a long pause, I saw what happened earlier. With the flight attendant. I know that look. I've had it directed at me more times than I care to count. You didn't just handle it with grace. You reclaimed the space. Silently. And I think that's the most powerful thing anyone can do. Sundar didn't respond right away. He stared at the tray table in front of him, then at Lena, his expression introspective. There was a time when I thought being seen wasn't necessary, he said, that if I just kept building, kept contributing, that would be enough. But I've come to understand that visibility matters, especially for those who don't fit the mold. It's not about ego. It's about permission. When people like us are seen in these spaces, it gives others permission to believe they can exist here too. Lena nodded slowly. That's why I lead now. Not because I want the spotlight, but because I want to hold the door open a little longer for the next person. Their conversation, intimate and profound, unfolded like chapters of the same book, written across years, across continents, but bound by a shared experience. They weren't just two professionals talking shop. They were two carriers of memory, resilience, and quiet revolution. By the time Lena returned to her seat, the mood in the cabin had shifted again, not externally, but internally. Sundar felt something shift within himself too. The day, which had begun with a small humiliation, had opened into something far more meaningful. The misunderstanding, the assumptions, the subtle slight, it had all led to this moment of reconnection, reflection, and inspiration. It was a reminder that our most uncomfortable experiences often contain within them seeds of purpose. As the cabin lights dimmed again, and the world outside the window turned to shadow, Sundar opened his notebook once more and wrote a single sentence on the page. Sometimes the journey doesn't teach us something new. It simply reminds us who we were before the world tried to make us forget. And in that thought, there was peace. The story in the shadows. The flight pushed forward into the final hours of its transcontinental journey, the deep night outside giving way slowly to the early hints of approaching dawn. Inside the cabin, time seemed suspended. The world above the clouds had a strange rhythm, slower than the rush below, where emails piled up and schedules ruled every minute. Here, in this suspended cradle of steel and light, there was space to think, to breathe, to remember. Sundar Pichai, reclined but not resting, sat in a quiet solitude that felt different now, no longer shaped by the earlier misunderstanding with the flight attendant or even the moving conversation with Lena, but by something deeper, something ancient within him, unspoken for a long time. He stared at the closed window shade, not needing to look outside to sense the world turning. The cabin was nearly silent now, just the occasional soft clink of glassware being cleared, a muffled cough from further back, the steady whoosh of altitude. It was in that silence that memories began to stir, not the curated ones for press interviews or polished keynotes, but the raw, hidden ones, the ones shaped by a different kind of journey. He closed his eyes and, without trying, was transported to a dusty neighborhood in Chennai, to to the cramped apartment where 4 people shared a single room, where the scent of samhar on the stove mixed with the buzz of electricity that came and went as it pleased. He remembered his father, thin and quiet, a man who never spoke more than necessary, but carried entire worlds in his silence. His father had worked for the British conglomerate GEC, and each evening he would return from his job as an electrical engineer, his clothes smelling faintly of oil and factory dust. They didn't have a car. They didn't even have a refrigerator until Sundar was in college. But they had books, shelves of second-hand volumes, science magazines, mathematics journals, old, tattered manuals on logic and computing, their covers frayed but their wisdom untouched. And he remembered one night, clearer than all the others, because it was the night that planted the seed. There had been a blackout, as usual. No fan, no light. The humidity was heavy, the air thick and unmoving. He had been 14. His exams were approaching, and he had been studying by candlelight, the flame flickering over the pages of his physics book. His mother sat beside him, fanning him gently with a piece of cardboard. The heat clung to everything. The silence was broken only by the ticking of a mechanical clock and the soft scratch of his pencil. Suddenly, his father walked in, holding something wrapped in newspaper, a radio. A second-hand transistor radio he had saved for months to buy, because he had heard a rumor that a late-night educational program was being broadcast, one that taught young students about basic computing principles. He set the radio down with the reverence of placing an offering. They tuned in together, their faces lit only by the dim candlelight and the occasional blue spark of static on the dial. And there, through the crackle and hum of interference, young Sundar heard his first structured lesson on algorithms. He didn't even have a computer, yet he was fascinated by the logic, the concept of solving problems step by step, of finding order in chaos. That night, the world opened up, not with noise, but with signal, not with brightness, but with clarity. It was this story, this memory forged in silence and shadow, that he rarely told, because it wasn't dramatic or glamorous. It didn't involve turning points marked by applause or headlines, but it was real. And now, as the aircraft moved through the final leg of its journey, Sundar understood something he had always known, but often buried beneath the practical weight of leadership. Every step he had taken in life, every challenge, every door closed in his face, every underestimation, had prepared him not for recognition, but for responsibility. Responsibility not just to run a company, but to be a living reminder that brilliance often comes from the margins. That power need not be loud to be transformative. That the world changes not because it is impressed by noise, but because it is moved by purpose. As if called by the shift in his energy, Karina, the flight attendant who had earlier made the mistaken assumption, returned quietly. The change in her demeanor was subtle but clear. She was not performing politeness now. She was present in it. She looked at Sundar not as a passenger to impress or apologize to, but as a human being she had encountered deeply, however unintentionally. "I hope your flight has been comfortable, Mr. Pichai," she said softly. Sundar turned to her and smiled, not a forced smile, not a public one, but the kind of gentle acknowledgement that came from inner calm. "It has, thank you. And please, don't carry that moment with guilt. We all have moments where we see less than we should. What matters is what we do after." She paused, then sat on the edge of the seat across the aisle for a moment, taking a chance most flight attendants wouldn't dare in the sterile, hierarchical air of first class. "I've seen a lot of people come through here over the years, but very few make me want to be better at my job. Not just better at service, but better at seeing people. You reminded me of that tonight." Sundar nodded. "Sometimes it's not the job that needs to change, it's how we see the people in it." As the landing announcement played and seat belts clicked into place, the moment began to close, but something lasting had already unfolded, something that would outlive the flight, outlast the miles. In a world where assumptions were currency and appearances often dictated value, Sundar had once again chosen a different path, a quieter one, but infinitely more powerful. And so, as the plane descended into San Francisco, and the early dawn light began to break across the horizon in soft pinks and golds, Sundar looked out at the city below, a place that had once been a dream, now a foundation. And he whispered to himself, not aloud but deep within, the words that had carried him all the way from the candlelit desk of his youth to the front of the aircraft and beyond. I didn't come this far to be seen. I came this far to make others visible. The legacy that can't be seen. The aircraft touched down with a gentle tremble, tires kissing the tarmac like the soft exhale of a long-held breath. The early morning light cast an amber hue over San Francisco International Airport, bathing the runways in a kind of stillness that existed only in those rare hours before the world fully awakened. From his seat in 2A, Sundar Pichai remained quiet, waiting as the cabin stirred to life. Around him, the other passengers began collecting their bags, adjusting their suits, reapplying appearances. They moved with the urgency of people trying to reclaim their identities now that the journey was over. But Sundar didn't move with haste. He remained seated for a moment longer, reflecting, not because he was avoiding the world waiting outside, but because he knew that once he stepped off the plane, the world would begin to look at him again as the title, the status, the symbol, rather than the man. As the doors opened and the warm California air trickled in, he stepped out of the aircraft not just as the CEO of a tech empire, but as someone freshly reminded of the stories that often remain unspoken behind every title. The conversation with Lena, the humility of Karina's apology, the quiet reflection with Michael, all of it had left fingerprints on his spirit, invisible perhaps, but real. Moments that would not make headlines or board reports, but which carried more meaning than any acquisition or product launch. Outside the terminal, his driver waited with the understated elegance of someone used to discretion. The black car's windows gleamed under the early sun, its engine already humming, ready to escort Sundar into yet another high-stakes day. But as he sat in the back seat, watching the city roll past him, he did something unexpected. He pulled out his phone and made a call, not to a board member or executive assistant, but to his communications director. "Mira," he said, once the call connected, "I want to change the theme of next month's Global Summit keynote." There was a pause on the other end. "Change it. But we've already approved the messaging. It's all around innovation at scale, expansion into new markets, future AI models, the usual pillars." "I know," he said calmly. "But this time, I want to talk about visibility." "Visibility," she repeated, confused. "Yes, but not in the marketing sense. I want to talk about the invisible stories. The janitors in data centers who make uptime possible. The mothers in rural India watching their children access online education because of broadband we brought in. The engineers who aren't on the cover of Forbes, but whose code powers the world. I want to tell their stories. I want to remind people that innovation doesn't always look like a product. Sometimes, it looks like a life quietly changed because we chose to see it." Mira was silent for a moment, then said softly, "You've never done a keynote like that before." Sundar looked out the window, watching a construction worker wave traffic through the streets, sweat already beading at his brow. "That's exactly why it's time." He ended the call with a quiet sense of resolve. Not long after, he arrived at Googleplex, the iconic campus already buzzing with energy. It was a place where scooters zipped between buildings, where cafeterias served cuisine from every corner of the world, and where ideas floated in the air like pollen in spring. Yet even here, perhaps especially here, Sundar understood how easy it was for those without power to remain unseen. The people whose names didn't end up in emails. The ones who built the walls but were never photographed inside them. That morning, instead of heading straight to the executive suite, he took a detour. He walked the long corridor past the engineering bays, pausing to greet interns. He stepped into a conference room where the janitorial crew had just finished their early shift. A woman in a Navy uniform stood back in surprise when he entered. "Sir, we didn't know you were coming this way." Sundar simply smiled. "I just wanted to say thank you. Most people don't see the work you do, but I do. And this place runs because of it." They stared at him, caught somewhere between awe and disbelief. And then, quietly, the woman nodded. "We see you too, sir." Later, in the boardroom, the presentation for the upcoming summit awaited his approval. Slides flicked by, profit charts, projections, product pipelines. But Sundar sat still, then slowly closed the laptop in front of him. "Let's not lead with slides this year," he said. "Let's lead with a story." A silence fell in the room. Sundar had always been deliberate, but now there was something new in his tone, something rooted deeper than strategy. The team around him leaned in, curious. "I want to tell a story about a flight where someone mistook me for less than I was. A flight where I was reminded that humility is not just a virtue, it's a message. I want the world to hear not about our latest tech, but about what kind of world that tech is building. Whether it's making people more visible or more invisible, whether it's lifting up the overlooked or reinforcing the old shadows." The silence stretched longer. No one argued, because in that moment, they weren't looking at a CEO delivering a directive. They were seeing a leader guided by something bigger than profit: perspective. 2 weeks later, the keynote aired globally. And it was unlike anything Sundar Pichai had ever done. No product demos, no corporate buzzwords, just stories, one after another, of engineers from small towns, of parents using translated voice search to help their kids study, of people who had been assumed, dismissed, mislabeled, and who had gone on to quietly reshape the world. The final line of his speech echoed through the hall and across screens around the world. "What we build matters, but who we choose to see while building it, that defines everything." It wasn't viral in the usual sense. It didn't trend because it was flashy. It spread slowly, organically, like the early adoption of an idea whose time had finally come. Months later, people would still talk about it, not because it made them excited for what was next, but because it made them reflect on who had been forgotten in what had already passed. And somewhere in the quiet corners of the world, on late-night buses, in coding boot camps, in rural classrooms and city basements, a new generation listened. And they didn't just see Sundar Pichai. They saw themselves. And that was the real legacy.